All right, well, thank you everybody for coming back for the second half. We'll introduce the panelists as we come to them. We're going to start with another 2-minute video where I was talking to Peter about a bunch of different aspects of suicide, which several of the speakers are going to talk about. So we're going to start with that video. It's 2 minutes.
I teach 200 and 250 people a term. I simply do not have the time resources to check up on everybody in my academic community. And I was devastated when I found out that my student committed suicide, and I wish that there was something I could have done, and still to this day we're having a conversation about it. I think about it all the time. When we talk about grief counseling, we're not only talking about relatives, people we know who have committed suicide in an immediate sense, but we're also talking about people in our community, our students, our acquaintances, and often we tend to take the guilt upon ourselves and feel guilty that we didn't do more or say more to people we really didn't know very well. And if we had only said something else, if we had only made an effort, this person might not have committed suicide. And then we tend to live with this like I do with my student. We tend to live with this every day. We can help people get the help that they need in a number of ways. We have to break down certain stigmas that are in society about mental health issues. Concurrent with that, we also have to change the insurance system. Many people go for treatment and then their insurance runs out and then they don't have access to continued care, which is a problem at the system level that needs to be addressed. The real question is, how do we break down the barriers and the stigmas regarding mental health? I think the natural tendency, if we know someone who's attempted to commit suicide or committed suicide, we think it's either our fault or we were not complicit directly in it, but if we had only given them more attention or done more, we could have helped. I had no idea that my student was suicidal. He sat in class, he was active, he was involved, he was engaged, he was funny. I had no idea that days later he would kill himself. I called his mom, I reached out to his mom. She was crying, I started crying. And, I mean, I felt terrible. Could you imagine how she felt? You linger on that, you beat yourself up. I mean, I'm still beating myself up. And I really, rationally, I know I have no reason to get down on myself. I didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I did everything right. And yet I still feel horrible about it.
All right, and we can shut that off now. Thank you. All right, so we're going to touch upon a few of those things as we go through this. And we'll work our way through each person one at a time. First here, some of you guys know Alane Miles. I joked last time that I would never want her on the stage because she's so deeply loved that she would steal the show, yet here she is again. Alane is an ordained Unitarian minister. She's a hospice chaplain for Hospice of Virginia. She's also been a hospital chaplain, and she's interacted with people that are suicidal or families in various different ways. She also runs a regional support group for survivors of suicide, sponsored by NAMI. So, Alane, I'm going to ask you to start by just sort of telling your personal experience. 3 of these people actually had suicides, with family members. So we're going to start with those stories, and then we're going to work into some other things. So, Alane.
Okay. I know many of you in the room as members of this congregation, and for those of you who don't know, years ago I was the minister of this congregation. And when I left, the goal was to spend more time with my family. And so we had a huge celebration the last Sunday that I was here. And that first week home with my children was just wonderful because I had been spending so much time at the church. And at the end of the week, it was wonderful, having that time with them. And so at the end of the week, it was Friday morning, and I'd been sleeping in for a whole week, which was the first time that had happened in 6 years. And my phone rang very early in the morning, and the first thing that went off in my head was, oh, it's somebody from the church. And then I thought, well, no, I've retired from that job. And I picked it up, and it was my mother, and she was telling me that her youngest sister had died, and that it involved a gun. And so my parents and the children and I went straight down all the way to Florida. We drove down where we discovered that my aunt had killed herself using a gun. And so that was an incredibly difficult time, and that she was 55 years old, and that took us, that first year was just agony. And as we came around to the 1-year anniversary, it was like holding on by your fingernails, just hoping the 1-year anniversary, you're just hoping we're going to get through this 1 year, and then it's going to be done. And meanwhile, of course, life goes on, and other things were happening, and my stepfather's brother was moving, sadly, and he had been involved in this church, and we were very sad to see him leaving Richmond, but he was getting rid of all of his stuff because he said he was downsizing, and he was moving into a very, very small place. And Mom and I were very concerned because now to us everyone was a suicide risk. And so I confronted him and I said, it's so much change. You're moving, you're getting rid of your things. Mom and I are so worried. Please tell me, you're not at risk of hurting yourself, are you? You wouldn't commit suicide, would you? And he said, absolutely not. No, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And within days, just days of my aunt on my mother's side, her youngest sister, days of the anniversary, we'd finally taken what felt like 2 deep breaths. And my mother called me, and Uncle Gary had taken his life. And he had never planned to move. It was never part of the idea. It had all been a lie. He had given away all his things because he knew he was going to kill himself. And so then we went through it all over again. And then about a year and a half after that, my mother's youngest sister's husband overdosed on drugs and died of heartbreak, killing himself after the loss of my aunt. So we went through 3. Eventually, my brother-in-law took his own life in the same manner that my uncle had. My uncle had kind of given him the idea. He had been depressed for years, and so at 40, he used the same method. And people say, I now run the support group that NAMI runs, which is a monthly support group, and I sit there with people who have lost children, parents, spouses, siblings, friends, and they say, how on earth do you do it? Do you feel like your family is cursed because you've had all of this loss? Do you feel like people look at you and are shaming you because it's your fault? And I say, no, I've never felt that way because I've worked in this. I've worked in it for years, and people who sit in these seats every week have been coming to me with this for years, and it was just our family's turn. So that's our family story.
All right, thank you. I think it's going to be hard to move on from each story. These are obviously deeply personal, tragic, very moving. I don't want to seem callous, like we're ignoring sort of the pain that we're talking about. My plan is to have the first 3 discuss their own personal experiences with this, and I do want to cover some other ground about what we can do to help minimize this problem. So next, Tad Bartley. We've been friends for about a year. He's one of the co-presidents of Richmond Humanists. He's Shirley Ramsey's nephew. And Tad, can you tell us about your brother, Chris?
Yeah, so for me, I've had 2 suicides in my close family in my adult life, and one of them was my cousin, who is my aunt's son, and she's going to go more into that. The first experience for me was with my brother, and it was it started out with some warnings from him, calls to my mother saying, that he was nervous, that he was going to hurt himself. And that was kind of the beginning of us trying to step in and doing whatever we could to help him. And this was about a year of very frustrating experience trying to help somebody who was suffering from, I think, loneliness, isolation, depression, wanting to go to the right people, get answers, fix the problem. And what we eventually ended up doing, one night he was backed into a corner. I felt like, he could take his life tonight. I took him to Charter Westbrook, and Charter Westbrook is a hospital that has since shut down. But, I took him in there and I said, I was hoping to get some emotional support, get started on some talk therapy with him. And unfortunately, it ended up being a very dehumanizing experience. They told me he was psychotic, and they put him in a room with no windows, and they shut him in there. So we had a few weeks of him sort of being locked in a prison. And really, the only contact we had was with psychiatrists trying to figure out, how they were going to help him. And it really, to me, it just seemed like it was just about, we got to find a drug that's going to work for him. And so I felt like I did the right thing, by trying to get him help. But I always wonder, in the back of my mind, was that really, that must have been a traumatic experience for him, But anyway, so once the insurance money ran out, they let him out, said he was better. And we had about a year of appointments with psychiatrists, adjusting medications, finding the right medication. We do think that eventually the medication started to work. We started to see some of his old personality come back, laughing, acting a little bit more like the Chris that we knew as a child. And I think we all kind of relaxed a little bit, Unfortunately, almost a year later exactly, on December 5th of 1995, I got a call from my mother, and she was crying, and she gave me the news that he had killed himself. He was staying with them and had just gotten his raise. He had been working on getting a raise at work, and just that day he finally got his raise, and his paycheck was sitting there on his desk. My parents came home to find that he had shot himself with a gun. And I always wondered, it was approaching the time when he went into the hospital. I always wondered if he was sort of remembering that tragic experience. We did find out that he had planned it as well. We found receipts for the bullets, and so he had bought the bullets right around Thanksgiving, and he was thinking about it, right around Thanksgiving. And I always kind of wondered in my mind if that raise was the trigger. Sometimes, I don't know if people know the experience of you put a lot of energy into something and you think if you just get this one thing, it's going to make you happy or make you feel better. And I just wonder with somebody like him who didn't have a lot to look forward to, didn't have a lot, he got that one thing that he was working for, and it just was, And then I just wonder about that, But.
All right, well, thank you, Ted. Now, last is Shirley Ramsey, who unfortunately has had multiple suicides in her family as well. And she's what we call a thriver, and she'll explain that term to you in a little bit. But first, maybe you can just tell us about your experiences, and then we'll get into some of the things that you do.
My journey started, that led me here today, when I was 8 years old. And my brother and I, it was his 14th birthday, we came home from school and Mom wasn't there. And I was teasing him and saying that, oh, I bet she's out getting your birthday gift. She never came home, and she died by suicide. She actually drowned herself. Left a note, and took us a while to find her, but we did. And so my dad remarried 8 months later, and I went on with life, and I remember I didn't have much opportunity to grieve that. I wasn't allowed to go to the burial. They didn't think it was a good thing for me to go. Life went on. I do have a resilient character. I, got on through school and decided to become a teacher. But I will say, when I was, my uncle, which was my mother's youngest brother, he kind of took me under his wing. He kind of helped me, supported me through college, and was just my favorite uncle. And when I was 18, I remember driving in his truck, and he said, I think it's time for me, I need to let you know something, that your grandmother died the same way that your mother did. And they were both about, I think one was 44, one was 45, I'm not sure, they were both about the same age. My mother had suffered from postpartum depression, which I believe she had shock treatment, so I don't know really what she was diagnosed with, but that's usually a sign that she had experienced some psychosis. And had been hospitalized several times. So, and she lost her battle when I was 8 years old. My uncle, who shared with me that my grandmother had killed herself, when I was 25, I got news that he had taken his life. He was with a gun. He had just retired, lived out of state. So here we go again, having to deal with another loss. And then when I was young, my sister is 12 years older than me, and when I came to Richmond one summer and was spending the summer with her, I used to love to come and spend time with her 3 children. I decided I really wanted to live with her, so we ended up, my parents had made a move, and so I ended up moving in with my older sister, became the built-in babysitter, and the new older sibling to her 3 children. So they were more like my little brothers and sisters, even though they were my nieces and nephews. When Christopher, his brother, when he was in college, I remember he had struggled. I remember he had struggled with learning disabilities when he was young. And I kind of suspected that he was suffering from depression when he was in high school. He was kind of a loner. But probably one of the sweetest, compassionate, funny children you would ever meet. So when I was in my 40s, I had my 3 children. Got a call on a Monday afternoon. I remember he had been struggling, and we had suspected too that he had also stopped taking his medication. I think he was worried about the expense and whether or not it was, sometimes when you get better, you think you don't need it anymore. And so when he took his life, I remember screaming, what the heck is going on in my family? So I ended up, in my career, I started out as an elementary teacher, taught 1st and 5th grade, and decided to go into be an elementary school counselor. Just about the time they mandated that they put elementary counselors in all over the state. So I got a job in Henrico County, and I thought, this will be great because it will help me teach my children the coping skills that they're going to need based on what I had experienced. I wanted to make sure my children, would really have what they needed for life skills and to do well. And thought I had done a pretty good job with that, and the kids, were doing great and did well in school, and all were very social and, pretty good, had a pretty good package. And when Jackson, my youngest, was in his sophomore year, freshman year, he was having a great year. He went to Hermitage High School. He was known as the most spirited kid. His brother was 2 years older than him. It was Mamsie and Jamsie, Jackson Ramsey and Mason Ramsey, and they were just, known by everybody, and were pretty well-known kids in the school, and were doing well. At the end of his freshman year, he came to me. I'm divorced, and his dad lives in Lexington, and he said, Mom, I'm thinking about going to live with Dad. And he and I had a really good relationship. We weren't going through too many battles. He was 15 at the time. We had a good relationship. He said, I want to get to know my dad. I want to build a better relationship with my dad. So I said, okay, maybe this summer, maybe you ought to go visit him some more. And he didn't really have that strong a relationship with his dad. So I said, if you're willing to do that, I don't really want you to go, but I certainly will support you. I can't be selfish with that if you want to do that. So didn't hear much about it that summer. And then at the beginning of the school year, he approached me again. He says, Mom, I think it's time that I make this move. And so I, was like, well, why don't we wait till second semester? He had gone out for the football team. And I kind of had a feeling he wasn't liking it. And I thought maybe this would be a way he could gracefully bow out of not playing football because everybody wanted him to play. He was 6'5", or 6'4", and he wore a size 15 shoe. And so everybody was encouraging him to play for Hermitage football, which is big at Hermitage. So I thought, well, is it because you don't want it? He goes, no, I just really think it's time for me to do this. And so I talked to his school counselor. I was puzzled. I called, and so I talked to his dad, and he said if he wants to do that, that's fine. And I said, okay, well, I'll let you go. So he packed up, and his dad came to go get him, and he went to go live in Lexington with his dad, and went into his sophomore year there. And from what I heard, he was the big man on campus. Everybody loved him. He made friends very quickly. He was the comedian of the class. I was told that there was one math teacher that nobody could make smile, but he could make this teacher smile. He came home for Thanksgiving. He came home for Christmas. I constantly kept saying to myself, why is he doing this, And everyone's like, oh, Jackson's so level-headed, Shirley, he'll be fine. He's just testing it was counselor said, a lot of the kids in divorce want to see the grass is greener on the other side, or just, exploring. And I had also taken adolescent psychology, and I know that's the age where they're really trying to find their identity and exploring different things and testing certain things out. Well, he came home the weekend of his birthday. His birthday's on Valentine's Day. Always said he was my best Valentine. He came home because his grandmother had died that weekend. Thursday, his birthday was on Sunday. She died on Thursday. So he had to come home and attend his only grandparent that he ever knew, funeral in the same weekend of his birthday. He also lost the woman who had babysat him for years. We called her his surrogate grandmother. So his two grandmothers basically died that weekend. And even then I could tell something, he seemed a little distant, but I couldn't tell, was he trying to pull away from me, and I didn't want him to feel guilty about not living with us anymore. I didn't want to put pressure on him. I told him he was always welcome back, but I wasn't going to try to expect him to come back and make him feel guilty. Well, 2 weeks after his birthday, he died. He died by suicide, by a firearm. So when that happened, I was probably obsessed with trying to do research. I mean, I started not only reading just the basic stuff, I started looking for research and trying to figure out what the heck is going on, what's causing this, how does it keep happening in our family. And I found the Out of the Darkness walks and found out that there had never been one in Richmond. And I'm like, you know what? I didn't know they had walks for suicide. Let's see if we can have them. So I got started with that.
That's great. Well, again, these are all very tragic. We'll come back to sort of exactly how you've taken these real grief lessons and done something wonderful to help the community. So Andy, I think you're the only one here that didn't actually have a death by suicide in the family. I did want you to talk about any related experiences that may have led you to psychiatry or increased your interest in depression. I also saw you taking down some notes, and you probably have some more interesting questions than I do. So if there's anything else you want to comment on from what you've heard, feel free.
When I was in 7th grade, one of my friends just disappeared. And then we were told he died. But, there was no funeral that any of us knew about. And it was never mentioned. And I think the best I can reconstruct is that somebody tipped off somebody that it had been a suicide. And I think that at some level was in the back of my head. And there's a family history of depression, and mercifully I've been spared anybody suiciding. I think there have been a couple close calls. And I think that probably contributed to my going into the career that I chose. And what one sees is that I think our understanding is still poor. Our ways of treating people when they do become suicidal is still, I think, would you say, far less than ideal. And one of the some of the moves to protect civil liberties of individuals, the civil rights of individuals, have had, I think, an unexpected downside of making it harder for them to get help at a time where they're utterly helpless and powerless and at imminent risk for self-destruction. I think as Tad talked about, the care of suicide is still, of individuals who are suicidal, the care is still way too tied into insurance and economic concerns. And what happened at Charter Hospital is not unusual. And I think the more we can do, and the more people like the people who are here with me, who've suffered the loss, bring public awareness to it, I think I just admire their courage. The pain of losing somebody from suicide is beyond description. And their efforts to bring awareness, we want to support in any way we can. And we want to try to make changes in the system. And I think what we saw with the Gus Deeds tragedy was both, I think, good and bad. It brought greater awareness, I think.
Can you elaborate what that is for people who don't know?
I think most people, is anybody here unfamiliar with Senator Deeds and his son Gus's suicide and attempted murder of the senator? Anybody need?
We have one, at least one, yeah.
Yeah. Creed Deeds is a senator the state senator from Bath County. He ran for Attorney General. He also ran for governor. I think a very popular Democratic politician. And in the fall of 2013, his son Gus, who'd been ill probably since 2010, and I think had been intermittently suicidal since 2011, was a student at William & Mary, and suffered bipolar disorder. Now it looks like was probably suffered schizophrenia. He became suicidal, and he became psychotic again. William & Mary, they went home to their home in Bath County, and I would strongly encourage anybody to pull up the interviews of Senator Deeds on CNN and 60 Minutes, and particularly the interviews on CNN. Few people may understand that. Everybody's familiar with Anderson Cooper?
Yeah.
Anderson Cooper lost a brother to suicide. And Anderson Cooper's interview of Senator Deeds, and to hear the story. But at any rate, Senator Deeds is in Bath County. He's at home. He tries to get his son into a hospital, goes to the emergency room in Bath County, and they can't find a bed for him in a hospital. And because of the way the law was structured, they had to let him go. So Senator Deeds takes his son back to his house. And this young man desperately needed to be in a hospital. The next morning, Gus tried to murder the senator and attacked him with a knife. The senator was able to get away and survive. Gus went back into the house and shot himself. And Senator Deeds has made concerted efforts to make changes in the state of Virginia, and there have been a couple changes in the laws, but they're still insufficient, I would argue. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll just end with one other thing that I don't think people are aware of, but should be. Abraham Lincoln in 1835 was acutely and openly suicidal. He was 26 years of age, and he was in New Salem, Illinois, and the woman he'd fallen in love with died, and he became profoundly depressed and openly suicidal. The village rallied around him and I think saved him. In 1838, he published a poem called The Suicide Soliloquy, and he published it anonymously. Historians are pretty certain it was Abraham Lincoln. In 1841, he went into a profound depression and was again extremely suicidal. And he was rescued, fortunately, by his best friend, Joshua Speed, and Joshua Speed's family. But we know that Abraham Lincoln was acutely suicidal on at least 2 occasions, and particularly the second time, significantly so, and probably came within a hair's breadth of killing himself. How many people know that? Okay, and I think in a sense we should all know it. And so the more we can do to raise awareness of suicide, I think few people realize that, unfortunately, there's a high homicide rate in Virginia. Twice as many people in Virginia die by suicide as homicide. How many people are aware of that? It's a public health, a significant issue, and just the more awareness we have, the more we can do. And I can't tell you how much I admire people who have been able to, who can come back from unbearable pain and put it into the kind of work they have done.
All right, I'm going to come back to Shirley in just a couple of minutes to go over some statistics and give us an idea of the breadth of this problem. First, Alane, you do counseling for the survivors of suicide, for the families. Can you sort of tell us what you do there, and then also tell us that you've had opportunities to work with people that are suicidal, and so if you can tell us about both those and how they differ.
Yes, so I am the facilitator for a monthly support group for survivors of suicide loss. That means those who are left behind. That is with the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and that particular group has been going on for over 6 years. It was interesting, the group that Shirley works with, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I first, after the death of my Aunt Libby, I looked to them about a support group and did a support group in town, Need Help. Well, around that time, my father, my biological father's best friend, completed suicide, and it turned out that his widow was running the support group, so it was in good hands of a friend of mine. We all make a very small, close-knit community. We all become very close. So years later, they have asked me to run it. And in that group, what we do is we meet together monthly and discuss the challenges that come. There is the obvious challenge of grief. That's the big duh. But there are other challenges. There are the challenges of the spouses of finances and what comes with that. There's the challenge of shame. There's the challenge of raising children if there are children left behind. There are challenges of siblings who suddenly have to take care of their siblings' belongings. What do we do with that? Every kind of challenge that comes with death becomes magnified when you're dealing with suicide. So we don't just talk about the feelings that come with it, which when you come to something like this and you hear our stories, it's really overwhelming, I think. The three of us normally don't sit together at things like this because nobody can handle hearing the three of us in one big, they spread us out. But there's just tactical stuff, just everyday kind of stuff that you have to deal with. And so we talk about that in that loss group as well. What's really important for you to know, though, is that suicide happens for all kinds of reasons. It's not just the extreme mental illness concerns. Those are some of the most obvious reasons. But something that is very near and dear to my heart as a hospice chaplain is chronic pain. I have people who come in who lost a family member who just never got their pain under control after a terrible car accident. And that is why they completed suicide, because after 22 months, they said, I can't handle this for the rest of my life, which is a whole different side of insurance and medicine that you think about and you think, oh my goodness. There's also recession issues and employment issues and all of that about the economic strain. There's also issues of marital, all about marriage and relationships and custody, things that have happened to people about custody that have eventually led them to complete suicide. And then there's this whole other line. The things you learn about the American justice system, what I have learned about people who have lost their licenses and spent time in jail because of their drinking problem, and then how that led them down a road which meant they could not be employed just because of their issues of their drinking problem and not being able to drive, that then eventually led them to completing suicide. Now, we all think, okay, there's also a mental illness aspect there, sure. But let's keep in mind when we say the words mental illness, that's the full breadth of health and illness. Just like when we say illness with ourselves, we're talking about everything from a cold to terminal cancer. That is the same with mental illness. We're talking about everything from a time of minor depression to completing suicide. And all of those things shouldn't lead in this one direction. And so that's what I've really learned in these counseling groups. And then, of course, in my chaplain work, and something that if we have time we'll discuss, what do we do with people who are at the end of life and are considering suicide, physician-assisted or otherwise, because they're at the end of life and they want to be in control. They don't want nature to be in control. So much of what I've talked to with people has been about that question. And that, I think, is, I've become a lot calmer when people say suicide to me, because suicide is a lot of different things at a table, and you can talk to people about things. And when people are talking about that, what they're really talking about is control. They're not talking about fear, they're not, they are talking about fear, but they're not talking about necessarily completion. They just want to talk about their life and what they're concerned about. So not every conversation I have with a person who, on a piece of paper, it looks like suicidal, suicidal, call 911. Not necessarily. When I'm talking to someone who is terminally ill, who is considering their options, they're not necessarily suicidal. They're just thinking about, okay, I'm at the end of my life. What does this look like? And of those people, I haven't had patients who have completed. They just wanted to have someone they could truly talk to it about, who would not shut them up, who would not say, shut up, you can't say that, who could talk to them.
Tad, I don't know if you want to pick up on something Alane said there about the environment has an impact on you, and that may trigger things and lead you down one mental course. I know you were frustrated with your brother that it seemed like the medical system just wanted to pump medicines into him and have that fix the problem.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, kind of how the environment played into it and made things worse also?
I don't know. Really, the big takeaway with my experience was that it's just really, really complicated and confusing. And when you have somebody close to you who dies by suicide, you're trying to figure out what happened, and you spend a lot of time coming up with theories. Is it environment? Was it something I did? Was it something, socially? Was there just a genetic thing? Is it chemical? And it's just a lot of circles, You want to blame yourself. Ultimately, I don't blame myself because I know that I did everything that I could to try to help him. I just don't think we have really good answers. I think we're still learning. And so, I could say, I took him into Westbrook, and it was dehumanizing, and it just made it worse. But on the other hand, if he may have actually killed himself that night, and the drugs might have been the best answer at that time. I am frustrated, though, because I think that some of the things I've been reading to prepare for this talk have led me to believe that our society is kind of happy with the drugs, a little bit too trigger happy with the drugs, and that we need a little bit more holistic approach that includes social support and education and talk therapy. I think we've got to be careful to just take these drugs are relatively new on the evolutionary scene, but I don't know. It's just confusing. It's really frustrating and confusing to try to help somebody who's having, in my case, having a family member with issues with depression and psychosis.
Well, thank you. And we're going to have Andy hopefully clear some of that up in just a minute. First, Shirley, can you give us some statistics and just put this in context, how big an issue, we see there's lots of people that have had suicide. How big an issue is it? How does it compare to, heart attacks as killers for young people, just so we understand what we're dealing with?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say that these statistics are what we have, but we're not. I don't even believe they're accurate numbers because there's so many that are unreported, and we do not have a national consistent reporting system. There is a reporting system called the Nonviolent Death Reporting System, and our public policy is trying to get it into every state. Right now it's in about 25 states. Virginia is one of them. And that is a reporting system that when someone dies by suicide, there is a reporting system and you find out whether or not they've been under treatment, had they had signs of suffering, depression, had they not been under treatment. There's a lot of, so what we have is through the CDC, and I'm just saying it's the most accurate we have, but I don't believe it is the accurate. But the numbers are astounding. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. It's the 11th leading cause of death in the United States. When Jackson died, the number was 38,000. It's now 41,129 a year. Died in year 2013 by the CDC. So it's sort of an even, it's kind of steady, but there is a little, it's kind of like this. It's not, hadn't gone up. It had gone up, I think, in the 90s or something, and then it's gone back down. It is I've got it here, in Virginia, it's the second leading cause of death for ages 15 to 34. It is the fourth leading cause of death for ages 10 to 14, and it is the highest rate of suicide is in ages 45 to 65. So you may think it might be your youth, but actually our middle-aged and elderly are where the statistics are the highest. 90% of those that attempt suicide don't necessarily go on to die by suicide, but they do say that 90% of the people that die by suicide either have a diagnosed or undiagnosed medical, some form of disorder, mental condition, mental illness. Let's see. what else I've got so many here. 50 to 75% of all people who attempt suicide tell someone about their intention. 4 times as many males are 4 times more likely to die by suicide. Actually, more females attempt, but more males are successful. And we think that may be that they're more apt to use firearms. That's one of the statistics. Another statistic that I learned that kind of puzzled me was, I always thought that most suicides happen during the holidays. Actually, the spring is the suicide's the highest in spring. So those are some of the statistics that I have.
Right. And Andy, if you can tell us, we talked about the insurance and some of the systemic problems. Can you talk about the problems of having a good theoretical framework for suicide? How that's hampered kind of medicine, and what your own, you've sort of, from reading the literature, came up with an algorithm that you think can help us detect people at risk sooner?
Okay. Again, I think we're still trying to understand suicide. I think there are probably going to be many different causes that are mapped out. And I think we want to continue to make sure that research dollars in medicine go to the study of suicide and to the study of suicide prevention. I think there are a number of theoretical frameworks out there. One thing we see, which I think hampers healthcare professionals, is long sort of checklists. And I think that hampers the people in emergency rooms, it hampers physicians, mental health professionals. And even though I think those checklists are accurate, in that, yes, the various things on those checklists are statistically associated with increased probability of suicide. About 3 years ago, a friend of mine called me, a physician friend called me, quite concerned about his college-age child, who they discovered was eminently suicidal. And I saw the young man and I did an assessment on him. And in retrospect, I don't think I did a very good assessment. He got into treatment, he's okay, and it sort of ate at me. And so I went back and dug into the literature on suicide, and particularly the work of Thomas Joyner in Florida, who I think has got some of the best work on suicide. And one of the things that I think you see is that all those checklists reflect, they're accurate, but I think you can get a little bit closer to the causal process of suicide with a very simple algorithm. It's just A, B, C. And if you remember that, I think you have a chance of stopping it. And it's, I think, as I said, it's relatively sound theoretically. I think there's evidence to support it. And you ask people, the A is for aloneness. Are you feeling alone and lonely? Even though you've got, friends or family, are you feeling very alone? Have you told anybody about losing your job? Told your wife, have you told anybody? And if they say no, if they've not communicated the things that are potentially contributing to their depression, you worry. How alone are you feeling? You may not talk to people, but is there anybody that relies on you? Is there anybody that talks to you? Are you just really feeling cut off from people? Anybody, even though you're walled off, anybody rely on you, meaning they know So you do, and a lot of this is intuitive. You just, you know, how alone and lonely are you feeling? And then I think the second thing to ask is, have you been having any feelings that others would be better off without you? Any feelings that your friends would be better off without you, your real drivers, or that your family would be better off without you? And why do I say that? Because one of the most interesting and tragic pieces of research is that if you look at suicide notes, I could take a stack of, let's say, 20 suicide notes and give everybody in this room the identical 20 suicide notes. And I would ask you to rate them on the degree of burdensomeness those notes express. And you all would be in pretty standard agreement about which notes you rated as most burdensome and the ones that were least burdensome. And you don't know the outcome of what happened with the writers of those notes. And what turns out is that those notes that you rated as expressing the most burdensomeness were the people who died and who completed the suicide.